Willey, and I've had the privilege over the past 10 years to serve as president of the Friends of the Georgetown Library, and it has been a privilege. Just a special group of people to work with here, and the Friends primarily are operational in helping out with supporting and funding both our children's and our adult programs here at the library, and it's just been a blessing to work with the staff and to see how so many within our community are involved with what we're doing here at the library. This is our Tuesdays with lecture series. It's based on the 1997 best-selling novel, Tuesdays with Morrie, and we've used that title because we think that book and what it speaks about is so very, very appropriate, and that is a continuing relationship between a college student and a professor that went far beyond the age of 21. And that's what this series is all about, as we've had now this is our 9th season of providing lectures on topics of particular local interest, whether it be history as it is today, or agriculture and plants and so forth as we sometimes have had, or geography, all kinds of different topics related to our local culture here in Georgetown and Georgetown County. And so it's been very, very special. Now today, our plans were to have Robin Salmon here. Now I think I caught almost everybody who came in who was looking for Robin. I am not Robin. Disappointingly, what happened was, early in the year, or toward the end of last year, Robin took a fall. And she is in recovery right now, doing well. And she had been in correspondence, and we had made all kinds of plans. I had to have a particular stool of a particular height, had to work out all the logistics for her, and everything was fine. And then she went to see her doctor, which she shouldn't have done. And he told her, or she told her, that she is not allowed to come and speak. And that was last Thursday. And so on our schedule, what had worked out, so we're back and forth and continuing. And so what she has so graciously and kindly agreed to do is she is sure that she will be well, and the doctor will give her a thumbs up for our May lecture. So come back again, and sorry, so if any of you would like to sneak out right now, we'll all look up and around, and you were looking forward to Robin, who has been an outstanding friend of ours and a great speaker. She's actually, this is her 3rd lecture in our series as we've been going through, and every one of them has been wonderful. Last year she spoke on some of the sculptures that are out at Brook Green that are related to military, and it was in the context of November for veterans. This time she's speaking about that relationship of Sandy Island and Huntington's, which is a really beautiful story, and was scheduled this month because of Black History Month. Anyway, in the way the schedule worked out, I was scheduled for the last one to do a lecture on who is the George, and we'll give it a preview right there. Who is the George of Georgetown? And so that is our topic for today. So again, once again, if any of you like to sneak out, and it's okay, you can have the cookies and coffee and still stick around. The Tuesdays with lecture series, as I've been saying already, is regularly scheduled. It's always the 3rd Tuesday of each month at 10 o'clock, and we hope you will come back and join us in the next couple of months as we'll talk at the end of the lecture. But this is a bit strange, because usually at this point, then what I do is I introduce the speaker. So sort of schizophrenic. I will give the introduction that I have on what was the distribution of topics for the year, and that is a retired local guy is who I am. So there are my credentials. But I'll go back a little bit farther, if I may, as to talk about this subject, and that is that my wife and I guess it's now about 14 or 15 years ago, we were living in Massachusetts, considering our retirement, and we put a list of things that we were looking for and where did we want to retire. No offense to Massachusetts, but it wasn't going to be there. And one of the reasons was, number one on our list, we're tired of snow. In fact, our last winter there, we had 10 feet of snow through the winter, and it was just, that was too much, and that was the end. Carol actually said she was praying for one last winter of snow. And our friends kept telling us, stop praying. That's enough of that. But also on our list of qualifications for where we wanted to move was something with history, some place with history. And boy, have we chosen an excellent place to retire. And so very, very glad to be here as Georgetown, to be a part of this and to be able to celebrate good and bad of history, and just a wonderful history that Georgetown celebrates. Also a part of that, as one of my early friends that I got to know when we moved here very early on, a fellow by the name of George, as we have some other Georges here, who introduced himself by telling me that he is the George upon whom Georgetown has been named. Looking at him and his age and the age of this town, it didn't work. But it did raise my curiosity, and that is, well, who was this town named after? And the presumption is you've got George Washington or maybe George III, but there's some other Georges in there. And so what you're hearing today is sort of the follow-up to that that's taken quite a number of years of putting together, and within the last 2-3 months, putting it together in some sort of a presentation to share with all of you. And I hope you'll enjoy it and find some information that is new and interesting about the person, George, that we're going to be speaking about, but also about our town and some of the great things that have been a part of its history and going all the way back to its very, very beginning. Now, the first thing to realize is we are not the only Georgetown. There's a lot of them, and I have discovered that in some interesting ways. Last summer, Carol and I, my wife and I, had the opportunity to be able to travel out in the west. We were heading for Yellowstone, traveling across Colorado, and heading into what would be the west entrance of Yellowstone Park. And as we're going across Colorado on a Sunday afternoon, there is Georgetown, Colorado. And actually, their insignia is down there. You'll notice the mountains, which we don't have here in Georgetown, South Carolina. And as we're going through town and stop to look around, there are posters for the Friends of the Georgetown Library. And they were having a book sale. And as some of you know, that's one of the fanaticisms for Carol and me in involvement here in Georgetown. So we had to stop. They have their book sale on Sunday afternoons in the basement of the library. And although there wasn't a single book I wanted to buy, I bought one anyway to support the Friends of the Georgetown Library. It was a few years ago, actually just before COVID, that a few people showed up at the front desk out here asking about a lecture that was going to take place at our library. And they were very enthusiastic, very energetic about this lecture that was going to take place, looking forward to it. And the people at the front desk said, "We've not heard anything about that lecture. Don't know anything." So I got a phone call saying, "Do you know anything about," and they gave the title of what the lecture was going to be. I said, "I've not heard anything about that, and it's not being sponsored by the Friends of the Library," only to discover that it was being sponsored by the Friends of the Georgetown Library in Texas. Interestingly, those people were upset. Why are they upset at us? Why is it our fault that we're not offering? But anyway, this is like a cross-section. And in fact, if you do a Google search, you'll notice generally, unless you've done an awful lot on Georgetown, South Carolina, that we don't show up first. Usually it's either the one here with the bridge, which is Georgetown, which is a section of the District of Columbia, or Georgetown in the middle down there at the bottom, Texas, and there's good reason for that. As we look through those Georgetowns, there are actually 55 Georgetowns. I challenge anybody here to question that. I've spent a long time. 55 Georgetowns in the United States. And actually there are Georgetowns in other parts of the world as well. But as you can see on there, 3 in Georgia, 5 in Indiana, 2 in Kentucky, 2 in Minnesota, 2 in New York, 3 in Ohio, 3 in Pennsylvania, 4 in West Virginia, and 2 in Wisconsin. So there's a lot of Georgetowns out there, and in several states, there's multiple Georgetowns, which I'm sure makes the postmaster happy, trying to figure out which Georgetown is it. Among those Georgetowns, the smallest Georgetown is Georgetown, Alaska. Population in 2020 of 2. Now, actually, there is one Georgetown that's smaller than that, Georgetown, Utah, which is a ghost town, but it still has mail delivered there. I'm not sure who they're delivering it to. The largest is the one back in the previous slide in the bottom middle, which was Georgetown, Texas, a population of 86,500. It's a suburb, a northern suburb of Austin, Texas. And for that reason, it's a really rapidly growing area. Now, here's a bit of trivia. Jefferson Davis was born in Georgetown, Kentucky. U.S. Grant was raised in Georgetown, Ohio. So we have our connection to the Civil War as well. But since there are so many, 55, it also means, and I've heard this said by several, there's a Georgetown in every state. Sorry, wrong. There are 13 states. So if you want to go to one of these states and open and start at Georgetown, here's your locations of Arizona, Hawaii, Kansas, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Vermont, or Wyoming. There are no Georgetowns. So those are the places where we need to make sure. What's also fun is going through and figuring out what did they name, or who, for what George did they, I'm pointing to a George here, I know. For what George did they name? And so as you go through, 2 are after George Washington, of all the 55. And then the small print, and I don't know if you can see it all, there are some are named after traders, a British politician, miners, a state senator, a couple for Mormon leaders, tavern keepers, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, an Indian trader, an Indian chief. Early settlers, town founders, a grist miller, a sawmill owner, a doctor, a son of railway magnate, a New England philanthropist, the overseas governor of the Hudson Bay Company, and one after Georgetown, Kentucky, another after Georgetown in the District of Columbia. In other words, town named after a town. I do have some favorites. Georgetown in Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, in Beaver County, is named after George Washington. That's one of the 2 after George Washington. And for good reason. In 1750, George Washington came through that area. There was no town at that time. But he came through that town in 1750 as a surveyor on behalf of the state, or sorry, the province of Virginia, to determine what was the western and northern boundaries of the colony of Virginia. And so for that reason, they named it after George Washington. Another one in Pennsylvania, which is in Lancaster County, which I had been through, we lived there for a period of time, and oftentimes have gone through Georgetown, Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County, is actually an interesting story as well. The town originally, when it was founded in the 1700s, was called Hard Scrabble, which is a phrase, or a word, I should say, a word for lousy soil. Somewhere in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they decided that was not a good advertising name, and particularly since it's a farming area. And so they wanted to come up with a title for the city based on something that sounded distinguished. That was the way they put it, and they chose Georgetown. Isn't that nice to know we have a town that is a distinguished sounding town? There is no George or anything connected to it. There is also Georgetown, Massachusetts, which is named after George Peabody. George Peabody was a philanthropist, very wealthy New Englander, and one of the things he did was that he donated funds. There's several traditions of this among wealthy individuals. He would spend money building libraries in town. And Georgetown, Massachusetts is named after George Peabody because he built their library. I think that's appropriate. There is also then the issue of George II, who we'll be coming back to, obviously. George II is the name base for Georgetown, Maryland, out on the Delmarva Peninsula. That's the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area out toward the east side of Maryland and those 3 states. And that was named after George II. I said here 2, maybe 3. Obviously, I'm going to be telling you that that's us. But the other one is Georgetown in District of Columbia. Now, if you read the Chamber of Commerce and the Daughters of the American Revolution history of Georgetown in District of Columbia, they will tell you it's named after George II. However, those who have written histories about the District of Columbia, Georgetown, will tell you no, it was not. It was named after George Gordon, who was a tobacco trader, the first citizen, the first person to settle in what is today Georgetown, District of Columbia. So you'd like to have something a little more sophisticated, but they got a guy that's selling cigarettes and cigars. You go ahead and tell those people up in District Columbia that that's the history of their background. Oh, and also, individuals oftentimes make reference to the fact there is another Prince George. There's Prince George County in both Virginia and Maryland, but they are not named after a king, but rather a prince. Prince George of Denmark. Now that seems rather strange until you realize he was the husband of Queen Anne, who ruled from 1702 to 1714 as Queen of England. And so Prince George in Maryland and Virginia is in fact the Prince of not England, but the Prince of Denmark. So we come now to but how did we get our name here in Georgetown? And unfortunately, it's a question that is not answered in any of the classics. So you got George Rogers' History of Georgetown County. This is a classic and a great book. In addition to that, you've got The History of South Carolina, which is Walter Edgar's book. This is really a fantastic book as well. I mean, this is big stuff, I know, but it's a lot of fun, and particularly if, well, I guess if you're a transplant like me and trying to catch up on all the history I missed in 8th grade, this is really a fantastic book, but no reference to how did Georgetown become Georgetown. There's an earlier form that I think reflects some of its history and time when it was written, David Duncan Wallace's book on the history of South Carolina. And there's another book George Rogers has written, which I found very, very helpful and very interesting, a South Carolina Chronology, 1497 to 1970, in which chronologically he lists all the events of South Carolina history. But nowhere can you find in there how did the whole name come about. So we need to take a look a little bit to our south. And let's go to Charleston for a moment. And in Charleston, we have an interesting, going back here to George Rogers' book, The Lord Proprietors in 17th of December, 1679. The Lord Proprietors, those were the ones who were given this area, both North Carolina and South Carolina, by Charles II, the King of England. And so the Lord Proprietors ordered the site of the settlement to be changed from Albemarle Point to Oysters Point. Now, you're familiar with Oyster Point. That is where the city of Charleston is located today. But the first settlement wasn't there. And some of you, or many of you, may be aware of that. Maybe all of you are. And that is, it was up the river a little ways in what is Charlestown Landing State Historic Site. And if you've not visited there, I highly recommend that. It's a wonderful visit. They have beautiful gardens there, in addition to the archaeological work of recognition of what was the original settlement for what we today call Charleston. Anyway, which lay between the confluence of the Ashley and Cooper, did I get it right, Carol? Cooper rivers. Did I do okay? Close enough for a Yankee? And ordered that the new site be named Charlestown. So when it comes to the city of Charlestown, which they're naming after the one who was their benefactor, gave them the site for what is North and South Carolina, there's something very, very specific. There is nothing like that. And so you have, but there's no such order that exists for the naming of Georgetown. So when and how did Georgetown become Georgetown? And so the answer to that is you look at documents. And the best we can do is going back in time to take a look at when did the reference to the city first take place. The earliest reference is in 1730, and the history or background of this is that increasingly the individuals who were in Charleston were curious about what were other possibilities of ports along the South Carolina coast. Already, Port Royal, Beaufort had been established. But at this point, there is a consideration of, is there something to the north that we've heard of in an area that they simply refer to as Winyaw? This area is consistently referred to as Winyaw in all the early documents in reference to what we today refer to as the bay. They also give that to the rivers, and everything else in the area was Winyaw. And so they hired what was a surveyor by the name of George Hunter, who came up along the coast during the summer months, and then in spring and summer months, and then reported back in December of 1730, at Winyaw Bar, I sounded the channel at low water near tides found 10-foot water. At high water spring tides, there rise 16.5 feet, and the same water has George's Town on Sandpit Creek 4 fathoms. George's Town was laid out in lots and sold last year, 1729, I add that as the year, to people who are obliged to build a house in 15 months, George Hunter, surveyor, in December of 1730. Now, what he's referring to is the fact that the town had been, in fact, laid out, and I have a copy of that picture of the city plat as it was established by William Swinton under the instructions of Elisha Screven. That had been done in 1730. It is very, very similar to what we have today. The street names, the street indicators, and so forth are all what we have in Georgetown today, with the exception of what becomes on one end St. James and on the other end Cleveland. But other than that, it is pretty much all that's in between and what we refer to today as the historic district. But there's our first reference in 1730 to Georgetown. That is the first time. In January of 1732, we have in South Carolina the publication of our first newspaper. There was no newspaper until 1732. That's a long time. The first settlers had come in 1670. So you have more than 60 years between the founding of the colony and the establishment of a newspaper, which gives you some sources to go to. But in 1732, in November, it says here concerning, again, that plat, to be sold, the lot number 23 at Georgetown, and there it is as we know it, Winyaw, and it was spelled with a W at the end, fronting the front 50 foot, 217 foot or thereabouts in depth, butting and bounding southwest on the bay and Front Street to the southeast on number 24. Any person having a mind to purchase, I love that. I guess you don't have to have the money, just so you have the mind. To purchase the same may treat with Mr. Elias O'Ree. How'd I do in that pronunciation? I'm doing good. O'Ree at Santee, or William Ramsey in Charleston. And that's from November of 1732. On the 23rd of March, 1733, whereas Landgrave Thomas Smith designs about July next to go from this province to Cape Fear in order to settle his lands there, he therefore proposes to sell or let the following tracts of land: 10,000 acres of land fronting Winyaw River, the upper part of it about 2 miles from Georgetown. These are the two earliest references in the South Carolina Gazette. Going over to the following year, to be sold, a tract of land, and I like this one because it gives you what were the products that this area was already known for, and we're talking 1733. Containing 1,800 acres with a good dwelling house, 30 foot in length and 26 in breadth. It also tells us what the houses were like. With many outhouses, about 100 acres of cleared ground, a large quantity of good rice and corn land, the pine land well stocked with light wood, being a very proper place for raising large stocks of cattle, having about 5,000 acres of good hard marsh. I'd like to know what hard marsh is. That's almost an oxymoron. Hard marsh, adjoining to it, very pleasantly situated on the mouth of Winyaw River and about 7 miles from Georgetown. Inquire of Messrs. Daniel and Thomas LaRouche, who are empowered to dispose of the same. They're very interesting people, will show up frequently in what is the early correspondence concerning this town. The LaRouches were merchants here in town, very, very successful. They were partners in Charleston with a number of merchants there and were the primary merchants here in Georgetown. Very, very successful. In fact, owning as many as 5 different boats that were going back and forth between here and Charleston in order to provide goods that were necessary for the growing population in Georgetown. Interestingly, as you continue on, there's a competitor that comes along to them, and his name is Paul Trappier. And if you're familiar with our town's history and some of the buildings that are there, his son, Paul Trappier Jr., is the one who is the initial builder of the Kaminsky House. So there you have a part of way in which history is all fitting together. And eventually, by the late 1700s, he is the dominant merchant in town. LaRouches have lost what was apparently a lot of their power and influence in the city. And then there's another one. I love this. One day last week, Mr. William Swinton, like they don't know when, but sometime last week, was made naval officer of the port of... Now, here's a good argument for being careful in what you put in print. We are now 297 years later, and we are going to criticize the typecaster because he missed it. And I'm convinced it was not called Georgetown. There should have been a G in there, but the type person just didn't get it there. Proofreading 293 years later. To show that there was some organization to this town of Georgetown, however it was spelled, Georgetown, one word. These are to give notice that the trustees for Georgetown will meet at the house of Thomas Bolam in the said town on the first Monday of September next. Now let me tell you about Thomas Bolam that's not here. He was the tavern keeper in town. He was the one who opened the first tavern in Georgetown. So what they're saying is, let's get together for drinks and the first Monday of September to give titles for lots to such have been given their old titles to the said trustees in order to dispatch the business. Those that are inclined to take titles are thereby or hereby desire to give in their names and number of their lots to Daniel LaRoche, there he is again, Esquire, in Georgetown, on or before the first Monday in August next, together with 40 shillings being the charge of the said titles. What's interesting about this is a transition that's taking place, and we experience it here in Georgetown, in that the initial founders and the planners of the town are the Screvens. Elisha Screven in particular. This is a wonderful story for another time, but they discovered they didn't own the town after they had done all the planning and sold all the lots and everything else was going on, that actually it was owned by a family by the name of Cleland. And here in Georgetown, there's a Cleland house that goes back to them, to John and Mary Perry Cleland. And so it's one of the fascinating bits of history. Not enough information is given to us. But when the Cleland showed up and said to Elisha Screven, this is not your land, this is our land, there's no reference to fighting. I think if I had put in 6 or 7 years of what was planning and selling of lots, anyway, somewhere, somehow, we'll find out what happened. But in terms of the documents, there's nothing. So that's what that's in reference to, is they're transitioning ownership between the Screven family and over to the Cleland family. That's also where 2 additional streets are added to the city. That's why we have a St. James Street, and at the other end of town, a Cleland Street. Even though the Clelands build on St. James Street and not on Cleland, never mind. So, as you have that all together. And then I love this. Again, we're skipping a little bit. We're not giving everyone. We gave the first 2, and then what is my prerogative of finding very interesting things. Whereas a short, well-set fellow of ruddy complexion, light sandy hair, who called himself John Eglin, aged about 25 or 30 years, being convicted of a felony, made his escape from the constable in Georgetown. Now that tells you we had a constable here in 1735. He carried with him a black cloth coat and a mouse-colored durry coat lined with red silk. These are therefore to give notice that whoever will bring the said Eglin to Daniel and Thomas LaRoche at Georgetown Wingyall or Isaac Chardon in Charleston shall receive a 50-pound reward. He carried away a light horse branded on the mounting shoulder with an R backward joined to an M. I assume the reward's still there, so if any of you are interested, look for that horse. Anyway, just a lot of interesting details and references to our Georgetown. But that still leaves us with, how did it become Georgetown? There is no command, there's no instruction. When the colony was first established, and it has to do here with governance. When the colony was first established by the 8 proprietors, what was done, and they were mostly interested in what is today South Carolina, minimal interest in what was North Carolina. But what they did is they divided up the colony into 3 counties. To the south was Colton, what is today the area around Beaufort and Port Royal. In the middle was Berkeley, or Barclay, as it probably was pronounced, as any of you teach philosophy or know philosophy, the philosopher is Berkeley, even if it is spelled with an E. Barclay County, and that was where Charleston was located. From Allendale Creek north was the 3rd county, and that was Craven County. Now, when we talk about that, it was not a populated area. Although increasingly there was a population in the area of the South Santee River, and as that population grew, that became more and more significant. Voting was to be done by county. But then something happened in 1704. The membership of the Assembly in Charleston became a majority Anglican. And although the intent of the colony was that there be a great deal of diversity in religious interests, the way it was put, anybody but Catholics. That was the way it was put. That actually was pretty much consistent up the entire East Coast. That included any of the denominations of that time. In particular here in South Carolina were Quakers and Baptists who were very active. The Methodists had not come along yet. And it also included a very significant Jewish population. That was here. In 1704, the Assembly in Charleston passed two acts, the Act of Exclusion and the Act of Establishment. The Act of Exclusion established the fact that the religion of South Carolina was the Anglican Church, the Church of England. The establishment was anything and everything that got approved, all the way from your birth and registration of your birth through your marriage and your death, was through the Anglican Church. So if you wanted to get married as a Quaker or married as a Baptist, you were not permitted to do so. You had to go through the Anglican Church. When that got back to England, interestingly, Queen Anne, who's the queen at this point, disallows the Exclusion Act that kept out other religious groups and allowed it to continue to be diverse. But the establishment one was considered to be in place. And what that did, and I mentioned birth and marriage and death, added also to vote. And suddenly it changed from a county government to a parish government. And what happened was 10 parishes were established in South Carolina, going all the way from essentially Beaufort and down to Port Royal, all the way up through Charleston and then north, with the most northern one being, I just lost, St. James Santee, which you're familiar with because if you've ever gone back toward Hampton Plantation in that area along the South Santee, and I highly recommend going down the old Kings Highway, a dirt road, down to the brick church. And there you're looking at what was the northernmost of the 10 parishes that were established. If you wanted to vote, you went there. So that was, and I'll go on, I can show you. Oh, no, I haven't gotten to the answer yet, did I? So here's what happened. So in 1721, it was enacted by His Excellency Francis Nicholson by and with the consent of His Majesty's Council and Assembly of the Province, and by the authority of the same, that the said inhabitants and settlement at Winyaw shall be, and is hereby declared to be, from henceforth forever, a distinct parish by itself, and shall be called by the name of Prince George's Parish. So, my answer to the question is, we are named after the parish. That is to say, after the church. That's where we get our name, Prince George. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this. That comes from, and again, this is an older book. There's actually two. Heritage passed on the history of Prince George Winyaw Parish. A little harder to find because it is out of print, but a more recent version is Prince George Winyaw Parish, the First 300 Years by Muff Boyd. They're both very, very good books. This is obviously a good coffee table, beautiful book, but also reflects on the history of what is that parish, that church, and our name to a very great extent. Now, why Prince George? It is really strange, and I'll talk about it more, but let me talk about the person whose name is mentioned there, Francis Nicholson. Francis Nicholson became the governor of South Carolina in 1721, the very year in which this decision was made, and he was the one responsible for adding the 11th parish. Actually, it may have been the 12th by that point in time, and also responsible for, as I say, giving the name for it, adding the parish and giving the name. Francis Nicholson was a lieutenant general in the British Army. His history, his story is amazing. Not all good, but he started out by being the lieutenant governor of the New England Federation. In the early stages of colonial government here in the New World, the entire area of New England was combined, in particular what was Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, in a single entity, and it was under one governor. As time went on, this is where I came from, they realized the people of Massachusetts need their own governor slash babysitter because of what was their inherent rebelliousness. He also then went on, this Nicholson, went on to become the lieutenant governor of Virginia. He was then the governor of Maryland, the governor of Virginia, the governor of Nova Scotia, and his last position was the governor of South Carolina from 1721 to 25. Now, it's very interesting to study his history because there seems to be something of an interesting pattern in what he does. He recognizes who appointed him and who he gets his authority from. So, for instance, when he is the lieutenant governor of Virginia, and he's been given the instruction in his responsibilities to establish a new college in the colony, the name he gives to it is the College of William and Mary, which was very unusual. He calls it after the king and queen of that time. When he becomes the governor of Maryland, he is realizing politically there's a battle going on between who were the individuals who were the original Roman Catholic settlers and what has become an increasingly Protestant settlement there in Maryland, and decides that one of the ways by which he can show his authority is by establishing a new capital, moving it away from what was the capital, St. Mary's City, and moving it to a new capital that he would name Annapolis, Annapolis, after Queen Anne. So one of his first acts here in Georgetown, in South Carolina, is in setting up a new parish in town. He sets up what is a parish named after the king-to-be, the Prince of Wales. So there's a pattern that he has recognizing. And I add that all the more because, let me show you, well, this is actually a map. Oh, there's a picture of the church I should have put up, I'm sorry. It's a beautiful church. But here's and I'll move away. I'm sorry, I'm going to go away from the camera for a moment. But if you count around, there's St. John's. These are 1706. You remember I said that's the year they established the parishes. St. John, St. James, St. George, St. Bartholomew, St. Paul. Actually, St. George came a little bit later. Then you go up here to St. Andrews, St. Philip's, Christ Church, St. Thomas and St. Denis. Here's St. James. And then Prince George Wignaw. There's something very unusual has happened here. And I love the way, and that also shows you how the county breakup was. Anglican churches in Carolina were usually named for saints. However, in this case, the colonists may have been hoping for an extra measure of protection, of favor from the crown and this earthly prince. So, okay, dead saints are okay, but who gives you the money? I love it also. In Sarah Lumpkin's book, she quotes, let me go if I may and read this. I'm going to Why We Got George. This is Sarah Lumpkin referring to a 1901 convention that was held here of Episcopalians at Prince George Wignaw, and one of the speakers indicated this. Prince George Wignaw suggests pre-revolutionary days, the days when the authority of kings and princes were obeyed and respected, when to name a parish after a king or a prince of the reigning house was thought to be a higher honor and to confer more dignity on the parish, and then here's where sarcasm comes in, than to call it after some saint of the church militant who had laid down his life for the master. It's rather sarcastic. Anyway, it is very unusual. They're all saints. And all of a sudden, Prince George Wignaw, and I think Francis Nicholson, this is one of those, I can't prove it, but it's something that's a pattern of what he's been doing everywhere and why it is given that particular name. And so who is this George? The year is 1721. It is that year that the parish here in Georgetown area is named after him. And so who is he? Oop, somehow I got that. Excuse me just a second. And who is this George? Well, there's a picture of him. In the poster that went out, some asked if that was me. My legs aren't that good looking. Who is this George? In 1721, he was a 38-year-old son of the reigning monarch of Great Britain, George I. He was the great-great-grandson of James I, the King of England from 1603 to 1625. You are familiar with that king. That's the King James Bible king. He was the first of the Stuarts, who were descended from the royal line through the sister of Henry VIII. If you like genealogy, you will love studying this subject and figuring out how do these people qualify to be king or queen. He is born and raised in northern Germany, the most recent British monarch born outside of Great Britain. He's been married for 14 years at this point, and the father of 5 children, including 2 sons. He will have 3 more children in addition to this, another son and 2 more daughters. And he is the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. So if Nicholson is in fact instrumental in making the decision as to what this particular parish is to be called, he in a sense is investing in the future, because the current king was George I. Let's talk a little bit about this. Back to the start of the story. So let's find out about our George, as I'll refer to him. What do we know about our George? Well, he's born on the 30th of October, 1683. Here's a picture, again, a painting of him, his mother. Her name was Sophia Dorothea, and his sister, whose name was Sophia Dorothea. It's very easy to remember, so you don't get confused. His father, who was George Louis, and I need to pronounce it French, even though he's German, George Louis. And the reason for that was French was the language everybody spoke. That was the first language. If you wish, different times and different periods where a language becomes dominant and is considered to be the in language, at this point in time, it is French. He is the Prince, lives in Hanover. He is the Prince of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and it is there that he is one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. So he's a very significant. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what his connection is and why in the world he becomes George I. In the early years of Sophia Dorothea and George, our George, their parents are, to say the least, unfaithful to each other. I'm not sure how to say this diplomatically, but they both commit adultery publicly so that the whole empire, not empire, but the whole province knows that they're doing this. Unfair as it may sound, and it is unfair, he can get away with it, she can't. And so the marriage is dissolved. She is exiled from the palace, never permitted to see her children, and will never see them again after he is 11 years old. That's why I refer to it as a dysfunctional family and the difficulties that are there. Now, on to his youth. That's a picture of him in his youth. As I mentioned to you about French, he only spoke French until the age of 4. Afterwards, he will go on to learn Italian, English, and German. He will be fluent in all 4 languages, and it's said that he spoke all 4 without an accent. That's how good he was. He studied, in addition to that, his favorite subjects, military history and battle tactics. That's what he liked most. Now, connections to the throne. I don't want to go too far in this because it just gets too complicated, but to realize, if you think we're in a mess politically right now, you should have been in England in the 1700s, actually 1600s. During the 1600s with the Stuarts, they had beheaded a king. They had gone into a period of time known as the Commonwealth, the Cromwells. They had come back out of that with the establishment of a king. Those kings they didn't like either, and so they chased one of those kings out and chased him back over to France. That was James II. There was all kinds of problems. Their qualification for being the king was you had to have royal heritage of some sort. Again, I could go through this and it would put you all to sleep and would take us until noon. We will not do that. But you had to be also Protestant. And the more Protestant, being defined as Anglican, the better it was. And so what happened was a number of the kings had given their daughters to what were German princes, particularly northern German princes, which was Lutheran, and acceptable because you could rather easily convert from Lutheranism over to Anglicanism. And so that's what happened. So along comes William and Mary, who come after James II. William and Mary are from Holland, from Netherlands. Interestingly, from the area that is called Orange. That's why we have an Orange Street here in Georgetown. It's not because there were orange trees along there, but from the House of Orange, William and Mary. William and Mary do not have children. They are followed by Anne. Anne will have 17 pregnancies and 1 surviving child who will die at the age of 11. So she has no heir to take over after her. That's that other Prince George of Denmark. That's her husband. You have that connection. And then next on the line, so Anne is ruling. We have her is ruling at that point. Who would be the next, since she has no heir? And the answer to that is there is another connector, a woman by the name of, let me get her name here. I'm sorry. I was doing good on names until that point. Sophia. Isn't that interesting? What an interesting name again. A woman by the name of Sophia, who was a ruler in northern Germany, and her son was George the First, who will become George the First. And so she was the one who had she was the one rightful to the throne next. Anne died, but Sophia also had died before that. And so here we go. George the First is going to become the king. Before that, let's talk about our George's wife. His wife was Caroline of Ansbach. Ansbach was an area in Germany 250 miles south of Hanover, where George was from. Here's one good thing about George the First, and that is he did not want his son to have a marriage like he did. His marriage had been arranged. He had been absolutely miserable, detested the marriage. So what he said to his son was, I want you to go and find yourself a bride on your own, and then tell me who it's going to be. He had heard about this Caroline, who is living 250 miles south of him, that she was first intelligent, that she was charming, that she was beautiful. But he knew if he showed up as as a prince, it would make it awfully hard for her to be unbiased in her affection for him. And so he goes disguised in June of 1705, and also under a false name. He falls in love with her. She falls in love with him, and then he tells her he's a prince. And it would be okay if we set up a contract and get married. And that's what they did. She arrived at Hanover in the morning of the 22nd of August, 1705, and got married that evening. That's how fast they did it, on the 22nd of August, 1705. They had their first child in 1707, Frederick, followed by Anne, Amelia, Caroline, George William, Mary, and Louisa. What's amazing is all but one got into their adult years, which is quite a contrast and quite unusual for that time. So there we go with their marriage. Oh, and he really loved her. There's a story after the birth of Frederick in 1707 that she came down with smallpox. She came down with smallpox. And with the smallpox, he came and cared for her, not wanting anybody else to be endangered. He got smallpox as well. They both survived the experience, but it showed his kind of affection and love for her. So anyway, now I'm down to his grandmother, who was that Sophia that was related to the royal family, dies. Anne dies. And so his father becomes the next one on the list and becomes George the First. He probably had not set foot in England, but when he arrives in 1714 for his coronation, 1.5 million people greet him in London. Probably the largest crowd that had ever gathered in the city. Probably a lot of curiosity as to what he was like. And when our George arrives, in an interview, he expresses the fact, I do not have a drop of blood that is not English, which was rather interesting to say, and that was not the case. Caroline joined George in October, but they left behind their son Frederick to be trained at Hanover. And they never got back together for 14 years, which is going to be a real difficulty. In 1716, so we're about 2 years after his reign has begun, King George I returns to Hanover for 6 months. He gives the responsibility of the kingdom to his son. During that period of time, our George will take a tour through the south of England to great crowds and great cheers. He goes to theater in London. Someone tries to assassinate him, but he survives. He is extremely popular, very well liked, whereas his father is not. And when his father returns, his father is furious, and what I can only define as jealous fury. And so what happens is, from that point on, the relationship between George I and our George is bad. He is not allowed to even live in the palace any longer. He is thrown out of the palace like his mother had been years before. In addition to that, his daughters are taken from him. Remember, his son is still back in Hanover. His daughters are taken from him and are raised by George I. He will not allow his son to raise the princesses at that time. So between 1717 and 1720, the home of our George becomes the home of opposition within England. All the opponents of what was George I's policies, and remember, by this point in time, the parliamentarian government is much more significant and powerful in England. So in particular, is a man by the name of Robert Walpole, who comes and lives in his home and gathers groups of people together in opposition to George I. Well, in quite a bit of irony, Walpole becomes the prime minister and the best friend to George I. And one of the first things he does in 1720 is he reestablishes the relationship between George I and our George. Now, connect to South Carolina and the naming of the new parish. It was well known that the two didn't get along. But in 1720, suddenly they're buddies again. 1721, the naming of the new parish, Prince George Wignaw. He's back in favor. And so it's appropriate because he will likely be the next king. And so it's a good investment on Francis Nicholson's part. Anyway, it really was on the public side positive, on the private side not, because George I did not give our George's daughters back to him, nor did he ever allow our George, to be ruler during the time that he would go and travel in Europe. So in 1727, George I, traveling back in Hanover, dies. Interestingly, our George, who is now George II, so I don't have to refer to him as our George anymore, George II at this point in time does not go to the funeral. And for that in England, he is praised because it shows that he loves England more than he loves Germany and his father. I love this quotation. His heart was in Hanover. This is about George I. He was more than 50 years of age when he came amongst us. We took him because we wanted him, because he served our term. We laughed at his uncouth German ways and sneered at him. He took our loyalty for what it was worth, laid hands on what money he could, kept us assuredly from popery. I, for one, would have been on his side in those days. Cynical and selfish as he was better than a king out of the Stuarts with a French king's orders in his pocket. So, and that's William Makepeace Thackeray, who was writing in a book, a biography entitled The Four Georges. And so now we come to our king. His reign is George II, 1727. 33 years he's the king. And so he's no longer Prince George, but he's King George II. His coronation's on the 11th of October at Westminster Abbey. He is a man of education. He will establish a university back in Hanover, which is still in operation today. In addition to that, he will charter a university in New York, which he will call the King's College after himself. You're familiar with the name of that because after the Revolution, which was not appropriate to have it as the King's College, it becomes Columbia College, Columbia University. He also establishes, because there was no college in New Jersey, what is called the College of New Jersey. That becomes, and incidentally, for a long period of time, the College in New Jersey was referred to as the Log Cabin College because they couldn't afford buildings and they were meeting in log cabins. That's Princeton University. Wow. So he is responsible for the establishment of those universities, 3 in particular. He loved music, especially operas. When his father had come from Hanover, he brought along with him one of the greatest musicians of the era, and that was George Friedrich Handel. And from 1712 on, Handel lived in England. His father had supported him, but George II was a great proponent of music. In fact, he commissioned him for special music for his coronation, and that music was what's called Zadok the Priest. It has been played at every coronation since. I listened to it the other day. It has a marvelous chorus. God save the king, God save the king, God save the king, God save the king, God, just like, but it's all different, as Handel would do. So you know why it's popular and has been. He also, after a military victory in 1748, wrote, again, under commission of George II, music for royal fireworks. And there was quite a good relationship between George II and Handel. But in addition to this, man of education and the arts, You remember when he was studying, he liked battle tactics and military history. He loved to fight. And one of the things that happened frequently in terms of tension between himself and his prime minister was that he particularly pushed England to go into wars. And particularly wars, and this is where it became controversial, that would help his kingdom back in Hanover get stronger and stronger. So there was a lot of suspicion concerning why he was interested in war and battles and so forth. He was involved, before he became king, in the War of Spanish Succession, known as Queen Anne's War in America. That's a war that we're familiar with here, as I say, in colonial times. In 1702, the people of Charleston put together a military force because they were very I should mention, that war is particularly between Spain and England. And what he did was, or what they did here, is the city of Charleston put together a military force and attacked St. Augustine and burned the city. If you go there and take historic tours of St. Augustine, they will tell you about how the people from Charleston burned their town. But it was not a victory because they never could take the fortress. And if you've seen the fortress, you can understand why. Then in addition to that, then 4 years later, to reciprocate, the people of St. Augustine came up here to burn Charleston. Ironically, interestingly, they did not succeed, even though the city of Charleston was at that point extensively affected by the yellow fever. And so they were able to win a victory and beat off the Spaniards. That war is noted for two things. One is that's how the British got Gibraltar. If you're familiar with British history and the significance of that. And the second was that after the war, which was predominantly a naval war, there were a lot of unemployed sailors. And what those sailors did, instead of going for unemployment, is they decided a better way to raise money is to become pirates. And if you look at history, that is called the Golden Age of piracy, all because of unemployed pirates, or excuse me, unemployed sailors from this war. I also should mention that George went to the war. His father wasn't going to allow him because he did not have a son. And as soon as he got a son, Frederick, then he was allowed to go to war. George participated in one of the battles himself in Holland at the vanguard of the cavalry. His horse and a colonel right beside him were killed. The British commander, Marlborough, wrote that George distinguished himself extremely, charging at the head and animating by his example his troops, who played a good part in this happy victory. So here he is actually in battle. Then the second war is the War of Austrian Succession, or the War of Jenkins' Ear, or King George's War, as it's called here in the colony, as it was called in the colonies. You have to, I don't have time. The ear thing is fascinating, but we won't go into that. From 1739 to 1748, George again, now he is the king, goes to war, and he led an allied force of Austrian, British, Dutch, and German troops engaged the French. George personally accompanied them, leading them to victory, thus becoming the last British monarch to lead troops into battle. So it's an interesting part of what his fascination was. During his reign, also, that Stuart family from the 1600s tried to come back in through Scotland, attacked in what became a civil war against the Jacobites, led by Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Probably you've heard that stories when you were growing up. And it was during that period of time that was a part of the Austrian succession. And then the final one was this, the 7 Years' War. The significance of I just always loved the idea in the old days they used to say, okay, let's have the 7 Years' War, so they knew it was going to end. That's a joke, never mind. But it's particularly depressing early on in European history when they had the 100 Years' War. That was really depressing. Anyway, it lasted for 7 years. But that war came about because the winners of the Austrian succession felt they had not gotten enough, and the losers felt they had not been treated well. Does that sound like the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II? Amazing how things repeat themselves. The 7 Years' War was an incredible war that involved the whole world. It involved Southeast Asia, it involved India, it involved all of Europe, and it involved all of North and South America. That sounds like a world war to me. Actually, it looks like there was actually more land involved in that war than World War I. That's how extensive that war was. The end of all of it was a tremendous British victory. As they went through all of this, Great Britain ended up controlling all of French Canada, all of Spanish Florida. In other words, the British now controlled everything east of the Mississippi River. A tremendous victory. The war began under the auspices and encouragement of George I, but it went beyond his time. Anyway, gives you all of that history of war. Struggles and sadness in the family. Just like he and his father, he and Frederick didn't get along. Frederick's home, when he finally came to England, became the home of opposition, hatred for his father, and there was no political outlet, and there never was any kind of relief in the relationship between the two. They really hated each other. Also, I will add, Caroline didn't like her son either, and there's some quotations about where she felt he belonged, but we'll leave it at that. So there was not a good relationship at all between the two. There's one point in 1736 where George II, will go back to Hanover for a period of time. When he heads back, they know his ship is on the other side of the channel and comes across, but a storm hits. And Frederick right away goes out to announce to everybody that his father is dead. His father shows up in the shore, and it didn't get over well. Then when he gets back, George II gets very, very sick, to which then Frederick announces, my father is dead. But he comes out to what was a political meeting to announce, I am quite well, thank you. This did not engender a good relationship between the two. In 1737, Caroline died. On her deathbed, she instructed him to remarry, to which he responded, no, I shall have mistresses instead. And that was considered romantic. His own death, 25th of October, 1760. And at 6 a.m., which was his tradition, he got up, had a cup of hot chocolate, went into the bathroom. There is a crash. His courtiers go to take care of him and discover that he has fallen and most likely has had a heart attack and in a short period of time dies. Never have hot chocolate for breakfast. In his will, he instructed that he be buried next to his wife in Westminster Cathedral and that the sides of her coffin and his be removed so that, quote, our remains may mingle. I'm not sure that's romantic either. I love it now. We're back to South Carolina. In the Gazette on the 23rd of December, 1760, last night arrived our London fleet, 2 ships and a brigantine, under convoy of His Majesty's ship, the Dolphin, Benjamin Marlowe, Esquire, commander, in 41 days from England, by which we have the most deeply affecting intelligence we've ever yet published, viz. An account of the death of one of the greatest princes and best of kings upon earth, no less than his late most sacred majesty, George II, of glorious and blessed memory, who departed this life suddenly on the 25th of October last, when all faithful subjects sustained a loss they cannot enough express. This is how the South Carolina population responded. What I find very interesting, it took 2 months for the fact that the king had died to get. Think about our media today. 2 seconds. 2 months. And then the natural and apparent, I'm going on. Now, a month later, they announce a new king. But I want to tell you who the new king is. Remember Frederick. He's the oldest son. In 1751, 9 years before his father's death, he had died. The oldest of his sons, he dies. And I'll have to tell you also, time is going, but he died playing cricket. He got hit in the chest with a cricket ball. So no hot chocolate, no cricket, okay? He died by getting hit in the chest. Now, it's very likely that he already was having lung problems and this complicated things. But he became a great sports fanatic. Both tennis and cricket were his games. It's often considered the high time of cricket in Great Britain. But anyway, he will die. But in the way in which the kings go, it is not another brother who will become the king, but Frederick's son. And at this point in 1760, Frederick has a 22-year-old son by the name of George. This is, again, I'm going to say our George because he's the one we talk about all the time, George the Third. So he is George II's grandson, not son. And he would rule for 60 years from 1760. We just think about that 1770s, 78, 1780s time. He was ruler from 1760 to 1820. He was ruler for a long time. And in this quotation, this is how they say about him in South Carolina. Natural and apparent solidity of the new king's judgment, his sedate and manly disposition, his love of justice, his hatred of flattery, his inclination for business, which sufficiently appears already by his close application to it, together with a strict harmony subsisting among the ministry, are sure presages of our being a happy and flourishing nation under his present majesty, King George III, and will in some measure alleviate our concern for the loss of our late most glorious monarch. They will feel very differently in 15 years. Anyway, concerning our George, with him, our laws, this is from Elizabeth Montagu, who was a very prolific writer in the later part of the 18th century. With him, our laws and liberties were safe. He possessed in great degree the confidence of his people and the respect of foreign governments. And a certain steadiness of character made him of great consequence in these unsettled times. His character would not afford subject for epic poetry. I'm not sure how much of a compliment that is, but will look well in the sober pages of history. There's a good summary of our George II. So what's his impact? Well, several things. Standing up. Do you remember I mentioned George Frederick Handel? Well, this past holiday, you probably heard or are familiar with the Hallelujah Chorus. And what do you do when the Hallelujah Chorus is played or performed? You stand up. You probably, and there is some doubt, you probably can blame George II for that. Handel, who wrote the Messiah in 1741, in 24 days, that's absolutely incredible, performed that for the first time, not in London, but in Dublin. It was performed in December of 1741 and in February of 1742 in Dublin. The following year, in 1743, it was performed for the first time in London. There is no record of George II attending. But as early as 1756, before the death of George II, people were standing for the Hallelujah Chorus. So you can blame George II for that the next time. It was his fault. Secondly, a war. That last war I mentioned, the 7 Years' War, had a tremendous impact on us. That war, I should mention the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, came through pretty good for England. And although the 7 Years' War was a tremendous victory for England, nevertheless, it left England with a huge indebtedness that they felt was appropriate that all in the empire should pay. And so for the colonists here, they established the Stamp Act in 1765 to pay for that war, followed by the Townshend Acts in 1767. That was the one that had something to do with tea. So you probably are familiar. So the effect was that George II's proclivity for war, in some ways, resulted in the United States of America. The third is a state's name. They were very, very concerned about the Spaniards down in Florida, and so one of the things they did was they wanted to put something in between, a colony in between South Carolina and Florida. And so George gave a general by the name of Oglethorpe the authority to be able to establish a colony, and the way in which they would build up the population was, let's empty out all the jails and send everybody to Georgia. So if you're aristocracy in Georgia, you know where your background is. And so a colony was established, and Oglethorpe's decision was, let's call it after the king. And that was George II. And then finally, a city, our Georgetown. There's George II. And now you know who is the George of Georgetown. There you go. You've been wonderfully patient, and we've gone long, and I apologize for that. And I'm the one who tells all the speakers, be on time. And I've done this to you. So it's the first time I've gone through it all, didn't know how it was going to go. but a lot of fun, and I hope you've enjoyed it and learned much from it all. I do want to thank a couple of people, both of whom are standing right back there, Julie Warren and Justin McIntyre, who were great resources and put me on to a lot of leads that were extremely helpful in doing this. I do also want to mention, and I hope you will pick this up as you go out, we do have a number of significant activities that are going to be taking place over the next several months that take us from now through May. And one is this afternoon. There's a sheet back there. There's enough for everybody one to have. One is this afternoon as a part of our Black History Month celebration, also as part of our children's programs, Heroes of the Underground Railroad. And a very significant part of that with local connections is Harriet Tubman. And it's for children, but my wife Carol and I have come to these productions, and they're for us too. So I encourage you to come this afternoon at 3:30 here for that production. Our annual Friends meeting is next Tuesday at 4:30 in the afternoon, a business meeting, and also we're going to have the grand opening of our Friends Book Center, and I hope you'll come and celebrate with us at that time. Our community art sale is on March 14th, a great way to get rid of the junk at your house you've been wanting to get rid of, and information on that is available back there. And then finally, the Tuesdays with. I had mentioned to you that rescheduled May 19th for those of you who came to hear Robin and persevered with this, I thank you. But Robin will be here on May 19th, and if not, I will make sure we get word out as quickly as we can. We have then next month Stephanie Whitmire, who's one of the faculty members over at Hopcall Barony, and has been doing extensive research on the pollution that's taking place even in those areas. And it's really sad, but an important, I do this phrase, sad but important message for us to hear, and what can we be doing? And then in April, we are going to have Christina Stewart, who works with the seaweed shell rings. Now we're talking about another period of history, down south of, in the area of, now we're down at Allendale, in that area down there. Thank you all very much for your patience. You all get A's. I'm a retired. Thanks.